Hey everyone, I'm here Celeste, and a few of you have been messaging me and asking to hear more about my research, and so I thought I'd talk a little bit today about my dissertation and what that was all about. I'm going to try to do some nerdy slides here too, so we'll see if you can see those. Hopefully they're not too small. Okay, before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land from which I'm speaking today, the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations since time immemorial. I want to acknowledge the historical and current colonial crimes that have happened here, and I'd like to take a moment to offer space for you all to acknowledge for yourselves the nations whose territory you are on, those who came before you, and the history and stories of the land on which you find yourselves. And if it feels right, feeling the land acknowledge you as well, wherever you are right now. Thank you. So the title of my dissertation was Unsettling the Settler Shadow, an alchemical investigation of the transformation of settler colonial consciousness. I'd like to begin by giving some context on what initially brought me to this topic. In 2014, I attended a school named Deshinta Bush University in what is now known as the Northwest Territories, a school for decolonization and Indigenous resurgence. There I got to learn from amazing professors and elders, and one in particular, Anishinaabe professor Leanne Simpson, who during our time there told me that the most important way that I, as a white settler, could be of service to Indigenous resurgence today is by addressing the cultural dysfunction and woundedness of settler colonialism, of my own people. She directed me to look for the healing of this illness within my own ancestral lineage. She said, "For once, your people were connected too. Go find those stories that can lead your people back to your own connectedness, to nature, to body, and wholeness, so that they stop projecting their woundedness and disconnect onto the world and harming all those around them." Let's see if we can get this bigger. So for the last 5 years in my doctoral research in depth psychology, I've turned to the study of the mythology of Western culture for its unsettling and healing potentials. Instead of appropriating mythology from other cultures, especially ones settler colonialism has already stolen so much from, through this study, I looked instead to reconnecting with settler colonialism's own ancient heritage for healing and understanding of the psychology of where it went wrong and how we can now recover. I am a white settler woman, and therefore, intrinsically, have racist beliefs ingrained within me and the culture I was raised in. This adds a lot of complexity and complication to my relationship to this topic, what my role is in relation to it, and where my voice contributes, amplifies, and positively adds to the topic or conversation, or when it is taking up space, when it should be Black, Indigenous, or people of color, BIPOC, speaking on these topics instead. This inquiry was something I reckoned with throughout this whole research process, which I will discuss in more detail near the end of this little talk today. My research focused on the study of colonial psychology and its history to look for insights into the transformation of settler colonial consciousness. My work isn't in and of itself anti-racism work, as anti-racism work should be coming from and being led by BIPOC. My research is more a process of racial accountability taking for the colonial psychology found within me, my culture, and the history of this land, and the horrors perpetuated on it for the last 500 plus years. My studies of colonial psychology and history built on scholars such as Resmaa Menakem, who looks at the trauma of white supremacy that lives in white bodies and gets perpetuated from those bodies onto the world around them. Scholars such as Simpson, Menachem, Ruth King, and others call for white people to tend the intergenerational trauma that lives in their bodies and psyches, and which continues to actively project that trauma onto the world around them. For my work on answering this call to action to tend the trauma and psychological racism of my own people, I used alchemy as a metaphor for understanding the psychology of colonialism and its potential transformation and racial accountability potentials today. But why the use of story and myth for understanding and transforming colonial consciousness? Neuroscience studies show that stories are easier to integrate than facts and figures. A 2019 study by Morris et al. Showed that facts-based narratives are only minimally effective at motivating behavioral change. This study referred to humans as homo neurons, quote, storytelling animals who are persuaded to make decisions based on the coherence and fidelity of stories, end quote. Stories have dominated human interaction for millennia, and their efficacy as a form of communication seems to be related to how the human brain processes, imposes structure on, and interprets information. Research from diverse fields suggests that story structure matches human neural maps and how we make sense of the world from birth. We process and communicate in story structure. Studies have also shown that people introduced to a narrative have an increased predictability of pro-social behavior. They exhibited, quote, story-consistent beliefs. People who were told stories displayed higher levels of empathy, autonomic activation, and emotional arousal. All of this meaning that engagement in a story engages individuals and their brains and can change their behavior, emotions, and beliefs in a way that facts alone do not. We are less defensive when hearing stories. They allow our guards to drop a little. And we know that the story of colonization and the delusion of white supremacy is one that quickly gets settler hackles out. Therefore, to appease settler brains and maybe let some of these realities sink in and allow individuals to be changed, in this dissertation, I turned to how mythic stories might frame what racial accountability could look like for settlers today. Engaging our emotional brain regions and hopefully laying the limbic stress system to rest allows us the chance to process and integrate the information coming in. Other cultures have long known what we need peer-reviewed statistical data to prove to ourselves. Stories teach, stories heal. Stories are how we learn, how we grow into ourselves, our communities, and our humanity. Facts and figures do not affect our brain, body, or being in the same way as a narrative always has, and hopefully always will. And so in this dissertation, I engaged the story of alchemy and read the story of colonization through an alchemical narrative lens. The intention of this approach was not to coddle settler colonials in this discussion, or to say that they don't also need to face and deal with a lot of discomfort in this process of unlearning racist beliefs and behavior, because they do. In fact, reckoning with their deeply uncomfortable pasts is an essential first step in this process. Using this approach is about trying to make the process as accessible as possible, so perhaps some people who wouldn't normally be willing to engage in these conversations were a little more open to them through a different medium. The intention is also that engaging with these topics in this way can inspire deeper and more sustainable transformation and change. A tenet of depth psychology, the field that I study in, is that stories and myths from one's own ancestry can bring about deep change of perspective, healing, and meaning-making. In particular, Carl Jung wrote that alchemy is the basis and inspiration of his psychological theories, which in turn has deeply affected our understandings of psychology and depth psychology today. Many of the founding thinkers of the Western world view were also captivated by alchemical ways of seeing and being in the world, including Isaac Newton, who wrote much more about alchemy than mathematics or physics. Newton and his scientific discoveries are foundational to so many ways in which we understand our world, perhaps almost as foundational as gravity itself. That the thinkers that envisioned how we understand the world today were also influenced so greatly by alchemy means that it is woven even more deeply into our history and ways of understanding the world than we perhaps ever imagined. And yet we rarely, if ever, think about it. And if we do, we are surely not thinking about how much it impacts our lives. Alchemy's history being buried away and mostly forgotten is in part because over the centuries the church has seen alchemy as such a threat. And so, this investigation of my dissertation hoped to bring this part of European ancestry that has long been tucked away into the recesses of settler psyches and history and take it out of the shadows, bring it back to life as a tool and resource for emotional healing. Most people who have heard of alchemy these days consider it a naive and foolish attempt at pre-scientific inquiry in the pursuit of magical, mythical prizes and wealth, which is definitely what I thought about it before learning more. However, many scholars such as Young, von Franz, and Hillman show that the alchemists were actually engaged in something much deeper than the physical transformation of elements. That is, they were pursuing psychological and spiritual transformation using the metaphors of elemental changes. Perhaps to stay in the patronage of the kings who were funding them, the alchemists wanted to appear as though they were working towards the creation of purely physical gold. However, what many were truly attempting to create in their laboratories and cook stoves was spiritual gold, and the transmutation of the heavy leadenness inside themselves into the riches of aliveness. They were building a psychological model of healing and meaning-making. Scholars such as Marie-Louise von Franz valued alchemy as fundamentally balancing and completing to the one-sided and yet foundational Western paradigm of Christianity. As Christian myths are foundational to colonial consciousness, my research posited that alchemy can also offer balancing potentials for colonial psychology. Alchemical models emphasize the importance of integrating one's shadow material, what they call prima materia, in the journey towards psychological wholeness. In alchemy, the muck and dung of one's psyche is worked over and over until eventually it is transmuted into the creation of inner gold. Likewise, the healing of colonial consciousness will require the tending of its most unsavory aspects. This dissertation suggested that alchemy provides a model for this undertaking. Building off Marie-Louise von Franz's view that alchemy was the completion of the Christian myth, my research investigated how alchemy honored the importance of the dark, where Christianity deifies the light. It honored the feminine, body, and sexuality, where Christianity can denigrate them. It honored the earth, where Christianity can objectify it, and supported individuals in journeys towards embodiment and living the fullest, most vibrant life on earth, whereas Christianity at times focuses more on the attainment of the afterlife. My dissertation looked at how colonial consciousness has been birthed from those places of degrading the dark, the feminine, body, sexuality, the earth, and focused on ascension and the afterlife, and how all of these values shaped the trajectory of colonial action, destruction, and genocide we have seen across what is now known as North America and in many other places around the world. And thus, having alchemy, which is a part of the Western tradition, act as a counterbalancing mythology to those colonial ideas was a compelling line of inquiry for me to explore in this research in how it could align with a decolonizing framework today. For decades, settler colonials have been searching for a meaning-making model, as collectively, Christianity has not offered as much to us as it once did. Often, white settlers have turned to appropriating meaning-making models from cultures that the West has already stolen so much from and oppressed. Some of these appropriative models include yoga and teachings from indigenous cultures that have been taken without permission and without the depth of cultural teachings and understanding of their histories of oppression. Part of what inspired my research was looking for a meaning-making model within settler colonial history that would be a more appropriate avenue for settlers to engage in, rather than continuing their appropriative meaning-making practices. It also looked at how alchemical metaphors can not only lead to meaning-making in settlers' lives, but also serve as an avenue for being confronted with the parts of themselves, their culture, and history that has caused such global suffering, genocide, and cultural erasure. I found alchemy offered a useful framework to lead to this accountability, as well as also being a more appropriate meaning-making practice than other stolen appropriated practices. The fact that alchemy has been so rejected by the dominant culture is perhaps another sign of the West fleeing away from its own depths within its psyche and history. In many New Age healing circles today, the impetus is to reach for models of transformation from other cultures, instead of turning back into oneself and facing the heaviness of the material, content, and resources of one's own past and shadow found within Western lineages, such as alchemy. Perhaps these appropriated pursuits have been more appealing to many than turning to traditions from their own lineages, as they do not require an individual to face their own cultural psyche. These practices have allowed individuals to spiritually bypass what they do not want to face within their own culture and jump into a practice of the oppressed, allowing them to identify with the oppressed, thinking that they can thereby shed their identification and associated guilt of being the oppressor. However, to engage with the alchemical philosophy, one cannot eschew one's cultural past. In fact, the very thing alchemy requires of an individual in order to achieve the psychological and spiritual fulfillment they so desire is the confrontation with their past, the facing of their prima materia, or primary psychological material. This is in part why I find alchemy a compelling practice to engage with for the settler colonial, called towards alternative meaning-making practices and integrity today. Reclaiming alchemy is a thread and a route back to decolonial potential. It is part of the roots of a cultural soulfulness to which all people have a right and responsibility, and it is definitely not all love and light. Another part of the alchemical narrative that I explored in this dissertation and its relationship to colonialism was the alchemical conversation surrounding searching for gold internally rather than externally. Alchemists emphasize the importance of this work happening internally, and that there was actually great danger in externalizing and projecting our internal longings onto the world around us. The search for gold being one of those dangerous longings to search for externally rather than internally. So this dissertation also explored the metaphor for looking for gold externally instead of internally in the context of colonial search for gold in the so-called New World, and thought of the white body trauma that authors like Menachem described as that which settlers were attempting to run away from in their journeys across the sea in vain. Hillman envisioned the colonization of so-called North America as an alchemical metaphor. Quote, "The imagination that invented the New World, together with the secret oppression in its heart, is quite clearly the same imagination of alchemy, which, within enclosed, introverted laboratories and hermetically sealed language, sought, above all else, gold. This dissertation took up this idea of Hillman's and imagined the colonization of North America as an aborted alchemical journey, the externalization of that which needed to be internally undertaken. Settlers came to know what is now known as North America, looking for hope, and instead stole that hope from indigenous peoples. These landscapes still bear the scars of the colonial externalization of this gold-seeking pursuit. By using alchemy as a metaphorical lens for the inner transformation that must occur in settlers today, this dissertation aimed to investigate the inner gold-making journey the early colonialists thwarted in their physical gold rush frenzies. The hope is that instead of devastating the ecosystems and people of this land, as the colonial external focus on gold has entailed, this internal process can help in the racial accountability, reparations, allyship, and solidarity for settlers today. There is an idea in alchemy that the soul is always striving towards the gold-making journey, and that when not undertaken consciously, the alchemical path in this journey can be perilous. For the alchemists of old, the alchemical life could lead to lead or mercury poisoning, exploding alembics, and raging fires. Metaphorically, these dangers today might involve misplacing our longings for psychological change on the external world, and trying to seek there what we are internally craving. In this way, we can liken early explorers to alchemists in their search for gold, ones that misread the map and instead of looking inward, traveled across the seas to look for their inner gold in vain. Again, I'm not suggesting this is the historical truth, rather that it might be a useful model, allegory for understanding some of the psychology of this history, a story to allow settlers to understand ourselves and history a bit better so we can work to change its impacts today. Alchemists were often thought of as the cooks of the soul. Alchemical processes are what unsettle the old and transmute, like cooking, the fixed aspects of our natures and transform them into different states. In its positive potential, alchemical cooking is trying to cook and transform something that is stuck and change it from one state to another. In its negative potential, alchemical cooking burns and ignites fires that can take over everything in their wake, causing death and destruction. In some way, early colonialists like Captain Cook embody this distorted and devastatingly destructive colonial alchemical journey. Captain Vancouver apprenticed under Cook and went on to chart out and prepare so-called British Columbia for colonial invasion. Cook and Vancouver did find what they called new worlds on this earth, but probably not the new world within they might have craved. After Cook died, Vancouver completed many more trips around the world, captaining Cook's ships and claiming in his name what we now call Vancouver and Vancouver Island, where I'm speaking to you from today. When white people first arrived in Dene territory, in what is now known as the Northwest Territories, the Dene called the settlers Quitia. In Dogrib, this word means rock finders or rock seekers. The people were given this name because to the Dene they seemed to be interested in nothing except seeking rocks, that is gold. They were Quitia, gold seekers. Much of the beginnings of colonialism in so-called North America was based on this pursuit of gold. The gold rush shaped the trajectory of colonial settling and development, perhaps more than any other force. Perhaps beneath the obvious economic gains the gold entailed, there was another rush within it those early settlers, Quitia, were seeking, another kind of riches they were perhaps craving. Though they were seeking this gold by tearing up the earth, an alchemical interpretation would posit that they would have had more luck finding what truly would have fulfilled them by seeking out the creation of the gold of emotional fulfillment and healing of trauma within. Rock seekers. Perhaps this is the most accurate description of settler colonials. In a different way, it is also what alchemists are, seeking the philosopher's stone, seeking internal gold. The settlers' external pursuit of it was foundational to what fueled the colonizing of so-called North America. Tragically, those early settlers got the recipe for how to make and find the gold they sought terribly, terribly wrong. My research posited that one road leading to more integrity for Quitia, rock seekers, settlers today, would be for them to undertake the journey that the colonial voyagers missed when they boarded their seafaring vessels 500 years ago. The voyage that they did not undertake, that could now be traversed, is one that perhaps evokes more fear than that of sailing the great landless expanses of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The journey they can now undertake is that of traversing and reckoning the depths of their own fathomless psyches and histories, cultural trauma, and crimes. If you had been able to enter into the laboratories of alchemists of old, you may have seen through flickering candlelight and through their smoke-filled chambers, makeshift shelves holding vials and alembics filled with feces. Some of these alchemists may have told you that they were trying to transmute this feces into gold. If you could have looked past the disgusting and obviously foolish goal of this venture, you may have realized the cook stove, fire, water, earth, and air the alchemists were showing you were all metaphors for the psychological work being asked of you. The feces the alchemist was trying to turn to gold was the metaphorical, emotional, cultural, historical shit of your own psyche. Through esoteric and often incomprehensible metaphors and allegories, the alchemists might have tried to guide you to the realization that investigating and tending to that psychic dung was the most valuable work in the world, as only through that work could gold be created and the inner dung be transformed to inner riches. Today, if we are willing to face with integrity, commitment, and honesty the rotten, putrid parts of ourselves and histories, like the alchemists with their vials, we have the chance to transmute our colonial muck and reclaim the inner gold of accountability, integrity, honesty, and anti-racist right action today. And we can work to transform the places within us that degrade the dark, the feminine, the body, sexuality, and the earth. In doing so, we could face and heal the white body psyche and historical trauma that Simpson, Menachem, and Ruth King have directed us to turn towards and heal, so that we stop projecting it onto and oppressing and harming the people and world around us. Eventually, my hope is that settlers find what Cook, Vancouver, and these early colonial settlers were obsessed with digging from the ground, what we, Quitia, rock seekers, have always searched for and never collectively found: the golden vitality of integrity and accountability in the depths of our own hearts and souls. May we also unsettle and disrupt all the loose colonial rocks we find in the shadows along our way. All right, so where this research must continue from here. In this particular moment of time, in comparison to the critically important work, not that one, and brave work being done in anti-racist direct action in the racial reckoning happening throughout the world right now, this particular body of work that was my dissertation has felt at times low on the priority list. As Ijeoma Oluo, the author of So You Want to Talk About Race 2018, said in a Facebook Live video during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations this past year, quote, "We are trying to save lives. I'm not trying to build a better, more enlightened white person. I don't care. I'm trying to save lives, and I hope that is what you are trying to do too." End quote. BIPOC engage with social justice because for them, it can be a life or death situation. White people can engage with social justice because it makes them feel better. There is tremendous privilege and injustice in that fact. It is a basic tenet of most moral philosophies that by looking out for others, we become better people ourselves. But I stress that this should not be the only goal in this work. Settlers must also engage in this work because other people's lives depend on white people of so-called North America doing so. We also have to be careful here, as this work can easily feed the white savior complex. Lila Watson powerfully said, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Watson's sentiment helps to strip out the binary of prioritizing why we participate in dismantling powers of oppression and emphasizes the interwoven liberation of our shared humanity. I want to emphasize the primary role Indigenous, Black, and people of color have to have in this work and acknowledge my positionality again as a white voice talking about racial accountability. I do not have the experience of being a person of color in this world, and therefore will never be an expert on anti-racism, and will always continue to take my lead from BIPOC. Part of this taking direction has led to this research of becoming accountable to the responsibility of confronting the colonial complex, its history, continued ongoing psychology, and the devastation that it has created. I acknowledge that this process of navigating the places my voice and research is needed and where they take up space is going to be a lifelong learning process for me, and that there will be places in this work and in life that I get it wrong. I commit to always being willing to listen, learn, and amend my work and ideas in response to BIPOC experiences, writing, conversation, criticism, and feedback. This dissertation's focus was on potential changes of consciousness and ways of relating to the world around us. Our brains understand stories. This story isn't to say it is how we cure colonial racism, but its intention was to be an entryway into those conversations, a model to look at some of the reasons why such destruction could have happened in the first place, and frame some of the psychological work as well as direct, concrete action that has to happen in decolonization, anti-racist action, and racial accountability work today. This dissertation did not address the real and necessary policy changes that are central to anti-racism and decolonizing work. This is the work that needs to continue to happen now. I believe that consciousness change and policy change are inseparable. Policy change does not just happen without shifts in the culture that call for them. Policy is a reflection of the people. We must change both to have a lasting, sustainable effect. Going forward, continued research, action, and emphasis needs to be on systemic change of laws and policy and must necessitate concrete action and changes for a more fair, just, and equitable anti-racist, decolonial society for all. Thanks for tuning in, everyone, and asking. You probably got more than you were bargaining for, asking to hear about my dissertation and my research, but I'm really passionate about it and love to continue on the conversation with you all. Yeah, please leave any comments or questions and we can keep talking about it. Thank you.